Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 95. And as you can all see, I'm not in my office today. I'm in WeWork. We're hosting an event with Eve Meller later. She's returned to South by Southwest, and we're having a meetup for any Austin Identity from 4 to 6 today. Please join us at WeWork at 6th and Congress. So the topic today is, are JWTs bad for authorization? Our guest is Eli Nesterov, co-founder and CTO of Spiral. Welcome, Eli.
Hey everyone, great to be here, and thank you for inviting me to chat about such a provocative topic, I would say.
So before we dive into that, Eli, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your own personal journey. A lot of our audience, they're just getting into the identity space and the security space, and it's helpful for them just to know, like, how did other people do it? So how'd you get?
Yeah, I think my story less typical, maybe to ended up in identity space. I don't think like even I am fully in identity space. My background is mostly about distributed systems and networking. Spent some time basically going through different, I would say, through low layers of the stack, working at F5 networks and doing, I don't know, layer 3, layer 4, doing SSL VPN. So it's like through my career, I've been like in a different places, doing application security, mobile security, fraud detection. I don't know, did some security research, but it's kind of always gravitated back to the infrastructure layer. And my journey with identity is kind of a combination of networking and authentication and authorization. Started years ago before, I don't know, joining a ByteDance and helping the company to build or rebuild better authentication authorization for infrastructure and get infrastructure security to, I would say, zero trust standards, right? And I feel that the book Zero Trust Networks that I've seen and read kind of get me in there, where you see the need and combination or intersection of both networking
Well,
and
that kind of
identity.
leads us into Spiral. So tell us a little bit about the origin story of Spiral. Sorry to cut you off there for a sec.
Yeah, no, it's pretty good. So that's kind of that's continuation of that, right? So I used to run the world's largest deployment of open source implementation of a SPIFFE standard that stands for Security Production Identity Framework for Everyone. It's an open standard that's built on the shoulders of technologies that's been there for years, like X509 and JWT. And so I used an open source implementation at ByteDance, running a very large scale beyond million nodes. I'm also used that experience to write and co-author the book called The Solving the Bottom Turtle. Very interesting book about, I would say, infinite regress problems and security and how SPIFFE helps to solve it. But starting Spiral was an inspiration of seeing how people struggling with build better infrastructure security in their organizations when everyone wants to do same things as Facebook or Google or Netflix, but instead of building this on in very bespoke way, Spiral helps companies to get infrastructure security and basically solve the how do you secure code from development to production, how do you secure a CI/CD in a whole software development lifecycle. And our platform is built on open technologies like a SPIFFE, X509, JWT, and many others.
Okay, so actually, let's talk a little bit about SPIFFE. So SPIFFE, our audience here at Identity Office Hours is more OAuth oriented,
Mm-hmm.
but we, have had a number of sessions on SPIFFE, including Evan. I think one of your co-founders was here.
Right.
Well, let's just talk about it a little bit. In SPIFFE, the workload identity is conveyed in an X509 certificate extension attribute. I forget which one, SAM something.
Yeah, it's a subject alternative name. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in OAuth, workload identity is conveyed in a JWT. As you know, you've been in the trenches for a long time, as you've mentioned. Where do you see the use cases for certificates is good, and where do you see JWTs being useful?
Yeah, totally. That's a fantastic question. I'm glad you're asking it in this way, because a lot of people think about SPIFFE. This is just, I don't know, certificate with SPIFFE ID that goes into subject alternative name, right? And it has a BUI kind of form in it. But the standard is actually about how the workload get an identity, how the workload verify an identity, rotate, and how it's get delivered. So the workload API is a part of a specification. It's a part above definition, so anyone can basically build their own implementation. But X509 is just like a one type of a document that described by the standard. It support JWT as well, and what makes the standard basically interoperable with both technologies, like anything that can understand X509, like, I don't know, certificates and do an MTLS. That's one use case, and anything that can understand to authorize or JWTs is another use case. They both have different usage and, I would say, different security guarantees that allows people to choose what they need and when they need, right?
Yeah, and I always forget that you can have a spiffy identity assertion that's also JWT, and everyone always reminds me about that, and then I forget it 15 minutes later.
Yes, and look, hey, that's just two document that's a standard described today. Like tomorrow, like there is lots of conversations right now about Whimsy, right, as a standard, and it's pretty easy to extend the standard to support something like Whimsy as well, or any other type. I don't know, SSH. You can think about as another form of a document.
Do we need
Right. Yeah, SSH certificate with a SPIFFE ID. And to be honest, like these are the things that's we build inside a product, because for us it's just, I don't know, another way of convey identity in a different document format.
Right. No, please don't make an XML version of it.
All right, I promise.
I joke that I really think that half of the CVEs out there are related to XML parsing.
Yeah, some of us too much. I agree.
So, as an OAuth person, I see a lot of similarities between the workload registering to a Spire server and a client performing dynamic client registration.
Mm-hmm.
Do you also see those overlap also?
For the registration specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great topic. I think it's more a topic about like the implementation. And I feel this is kind of the biggest misunderstanding about the SPIFFE inspired. People see them as kind of the whole thing, where like SPIFFE is a standard like an OAuth, right? And there is a different implementations for OAuth, like a key cloak, for instance. There is also commercial implementation, right? So Spire is just an open source implementation. Spiral is a closed source enterprise ready implementation of the same standard like an authz, right? And therefore they have a different concept. So open source has a concept of registration that's like probably closer to OAuth implementation, but this is not the details that's, I would say, dictated by the standard. So standard does not focus on this. It's just like, how do you implement resolution of what's a workload and what identity it should get. This is like the glue is in there. And I feel this is often kind of get people confused that there are different models, right? And in OAuth, you actually need to, hey, I don't know, talking about simple things for workloads, here's client ID, and secret, right? And this is type of identity you will get when, or access token, when you authenticate to a server. When with the SPIF implementation, it's different. Workload doesn't have anything to say like, oh, here's the thing about me, and I need to give it like, and give me identity based on this. It's like in a SPIFy world, workload only can choose what type of identity to get, and because it's requesting identity through not local Unix domain sockets, it's up to implementation how you assign it, right? So open source, like Spire implementation and closer spiral implementation, does this through different attestation mechanisms, like looking into what is a process ID and then getting information through the, like from Linux kernel about, hey, give me an information about what do you know about this process, right? And you can learn what's users running, groups, where the file, what's the binary path of the process, etc. Anything that you can get. Or if it's a, I don't know, process that's running in a container and orchestrated by Kubernetes, right? Then SPIFy agent can ask Kubernetes API, hey, tell me everything that you know about this and learn, I don't know, the whole pod spec. So that's process called an attestation. That's basically open source implementation used to assign an identity. Right. And it's assigned based on this kind of pre-registration mechanism, right? So basically saying, if you see the workload with these attributes running on this node, give it identity with this SPIFy ID.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So just to recap a little bit, you're saying that the workload gets an ID is up to the implementation,
exactly,
specific implementation,
right.
And that during that registration process, whatever it is, the client will make some type of attestation that might not include an identifier, or might not include an identifier.
Yeah, identifier never included as a part of attestation, right? Identifier is a SPIFy ID that goes into the document where they're like, at this point, JWT or X509. So when you, in open source implementation, when you do registration, you basically saying, okay, if you see workload with these attributes, it got this identifier in whatever format of the document that workload requested. Let's say,
so the server issues the identifier. Does it always issue a unique identifier, or might it issue different?
It's always unique identifier for the same workload with the same attributes. So like, let's say if the workload running in a namespace foo and let's say pod called like a bar or a deployment called bar, it can get like SPIFy identity or identifier inside a document, I don't know, my best service. It's like, this is what registration process basically saying, right? When you see the workload running in this namespace with this name, give it the document with identifier of your choice. An identifier that's something that allows you to structure. So it's like, remember that SPIFy ID is a URI that has a trust domain part, which is basically very similar to domain name, and a path part. And a path part that helps you to structure it in a way that you can follow basically natural organization properties like departments, regions, product names, product lines, etc. All this is only for authentication purposes, right? Like SPIFy doesn't solve a problem of authentication and authorization at the same time. It's only focused on identity that can be used for an authentication, but then you bring your own authorization on top of it. But decoupling the systems it is what makes you actually often think from a first principles and make both systems simpler rather than trying to solve two, I feel, very complex problems. one is like, how do you provide identity to a software process or something? And another one is like, how do you do authorization, right? They both very complex.
We're going to pivot to authorization, and I end up pivoting every conversation to authorization, whether it's on the schedule or not. But there's one more question before we do that, because I'm actually just really curious. There's a new work group at the IETF called the WIMSI work group, workload identity management something something systems. I don't know. It sounds like they just wanted WIMSI. But is Spiral participating in that, or I'm just curious? It's a new work group. Do you have any initial thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a new work group. We've been participating in it from a beginning. In ATF, the couple of company members like Evan Gilman and Peter Castleman, who is I think he's a chair on that working group.
Microsoft guy,
former Microsoft guy who decided to join Spiral. Yeah, so they both kind of driving the effort in that working group, among with other peers from different companies, and the goal of the group to solve multiple complex use cases, right? Because like workloads often need to communicate across the boundaries, and workloads often needs to be aware of the users who send in a request. I mean, let's say to acquire some data or do data processing. So this combination makes it like very interesting. I would say it's like on the edge of what many or some companies trying to solve, the combination of human identity and machine identity. How do I apply them together to solve the use cases? Oh, I'm spinning, I don't know, with AI agent, that will be definitely, we'll hear about this bigger, because like, hey, I'm sending the request or I'm processing the data in the data pipelines, but me and you might have different access rights to the data, but we both can spin a workload. And what the situation you want to avoid is me spinning some workflow or asking AI agent having access to the data that I cannot directly access. Right.
Yeah, so we're spinning into authorization. So let's just officially go there.
Let's go.
So I guess my first question around authorization is so I had posted a blog a couple of weeks back about an idea around token-based access control, and my theory is that our access control is it's too person-centric, in that we really just need to say, given this bundle of tokens, and that tokens can include attestations, maybe from platform providers like Google or Apple, or from authenticators, like is this a device-bound credential or is it a shared credential? Or other attestations like you're mentioning from hardware even. So there's a bundle of tokens, and that my theory of token-based access control says, given this bundle of tokens, should we allow access on this resource? And so in the course of that conversation, you raised some concerns about how JWTs, are not a panacea. They're not a silver bullet. And actually, the design, how you implement and design these JWT-based systems is really important. You raised a couple of concerns about that. But maybe we could start with the first concern that you raised, which was JWT bloat. So if the idea is that we're going to put a lot of information, if the JWT is in a way what we call the PIP, the policy information point, we're going to stuff a lot of information in that JWT. JWT might get really big, and what problems might that cause? And what have you seen? Oops! Oh no! Sorry.
Someone calling. Let's cancel them.
Of course, my son calling me in the middle of a live stream. Okay,
I hope everything is all right.
John.
Yeah, so Yeah, I think I'm kind of warning everyone that this is a dangerous path. It does mean that's like JWTs or tokens in general, but for authorization, it's a perfect mechanism, especially if you need to transit through proxies, API gateways, like layer 7 load balancers and things like this in the situations when you cannot use like, I don't know, X509, right? Because like doing MTLS over TLS or MTLS is not a fun thing. But what I've seen is often happens is like, hey, if you in your organization you provide a mechanism, and I don't know, it does matter if you use JWTs for let's say human authentication authorization or for machine to machine. Like the dangerous path that I've seen in the past, you normally have identifier of what is that. Is it like user or what's a user or what's a workload, right, in machine world? And then I feel that this depends on what an authorization system uses. Is it centralized or distributed? And that creating different interesting problems, because when it's centralized, on the information you need is to call central server and say, it's like, okay, here is an identity. Is this identity allowed to perform the action, right? But often this is like a compromise for latency and the load. And I mean, I don't need to explain to you, an expert in authorization,
Yeah, there's a
different
number of
models.
models. The PDP could be resolved locally, it could be embedded, it could be a
Mm-hmm.
sidecar, or it could be a cloud call. And depending upon the use case, those
Right.
are all in different use cases. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like the simple use case for an authorization, right? If you use like, let's say, access list type, right? That's might be easier to distribute or have, and you can make a decision right away based on information from a token and identifier. But when you go in and build in like RBAC and ABAC type of systems that requires additional attributes and information, like where this information is delivered, and kind of I feel the natural knee-jerk reaction, oh, we have a token, let's put it there,
Yeah.
which is perfectly fine for some amount of information. What I always kind of trying to point out is like, please be like, consider what information you put in there, because like, let's say you want to use a groups information, and these groups information coming from your Active Directory
Yeah.
or like through different
That's a great
means,
example. Yeah.
right? And then what's going to happen is like, yeah, it will be perfectly working for me who joined this company. I don't know, this year I might be participating in, I might have like 20 groups, and that's totally fine. But someone who worked in this organization for 25 years, and we know that groups are never cleaned from Active Directory, might have actually a lot. And the funniest story I know, I like it, recently had a conversation with a customer. They have a person who worked there for like, it's my 25th anniversary, and I finding all sort of bugs and all the on all the software that we use, because I'm trying to get access. It often does work because of that mechanism of like group resolution. Yeah, so that's kind of one of example of this dynamic value for claims that you need to evaluate.
Right.
And
Can be really hard too to run down a problem like that. I also want to point out that there's different ways to deliver these JWTs. And the one that you're talking about that I think people need to really think about is when you put the JWT in the header as the authorization header,
right.
and that's being consumed like a traditional access token presented to
Mm-hmm.
UI. It's not the only way you can deliver tokens. You can deliver tokens in the body.
Right.
But if you're using that mechanism of putting access tokens in the authorization header, you need to be really careful about the size.
Right.
Example is a great one, and that can be really hard to track down when an intermittent problem with this user who happens to have been here for a long time. That can really drive you crazy.
Yeah, it's not a funny things to resolve on both, I would say, human and machine world. Yeah, and I feel like I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like in 99% of the cases the JWT goes into authorization header, which creates like a funny problems like how request goes to services or servers or an application inside an infrastructure through a bunch of load balancers and a proxies that's often like in a large organization, managed by different teams, and which creates interesting intermittent issues. It's like, oh, the requests go into a service through different proxies and one happened to be configured with default settings, and default settings limiting, like, let's say, the size of the header to 2 or 4K, right? And then you kind of having this fun, it's working, but it's not working for the same user. And
Right.
debugging is never fun. Like, yeah, that's kind of, I think this is where it's starting for me, pointing out. It's like, yeah, that's normal, but just please be aware of this, like a dangerous path where it can bring you. And I've seen it happening on both kind of sides, on human and machine world. I think I pointed to one of the colleague of mine from Netflix who wrote a book, in Hacken, who've been, yeah, you need to jump in there. Yeah, who've been chatting about it, and he mentioned some of these examples that they had in their infrastructure level, because developers often creative and they're like, hey, we have a JWT, can we put more information there when we issue there? Yeah, let's do this. And then it's
I'm all for token enrichment. I love token enrichment, so I totally understand. And no, I think it's a fair point. And what also would worry me is if you're tempted to put binary information in there, like the keys themselves or certificates themselves in those JWTs can also get large. So yeah, you really have to. I mean, it needs to be designed and considered
right
in those JWTs.
Exactly. This is where, like, I feel standards like SPIFFE actually pushes you to think, because providing two type of identities, like, you need to think about how your, let's say, authorization system gonna work using different types of identities. And like in a SPIFFE, you can put this information into SPIFFE ID path part, right? But it's limited because of their X509. And yeah, JWT has claims, but can you have the same or similar mechanism in X509? You probably can do hacks through some extensions to put it in there, but that would require your TLS, MTLS layer, or anything that's processing and verifying certificates to be aware of this kind of abuse of the extensions of X509, where this additional information resides. And yeah, so the binary information that you mentioned is just like when people are running into issues like of dynamic information or limitations of the headers, the next thing they come up with is basically some interesting encoding schemes that's
like CBOR.
Right, but this is kind of standardized version. You can, like, we engineers, we're creative. And we love to invent our own wheels. So yeah, I've seen quite interesting schemes people come up with.
I was just telling you about a new binary encoding. The OAuth status list is basically a type of binary encoding, and it's really efficient. It's really small, but everyone needs to know how to read that, how to pull apart the bits and understand what that means.
Yeah, totally. I don't know. I've seen ways where people just have a list or have a file with like a group mapping to some number, and then this is get encoded inside the chart. You can imagine that looks like a really magic. It's like, oh, what is this number? So how we come up with this?
Yeah.
So
No, we've certainly been there. And so one of the issues you raise is sort of an existential problem with like security, I think, going back since the beginning of time, but it's revocation. Um, X509 has a mechanism for revocation. JWTs, there's a new spec that's I hear is going to go final soon about called OAuth status lists. Um, but what do you see? You're really like in the trenches. You've been in the trenches for a long time. Have you seen areas where expirations of JWTs was an issue, or there were long-lived JWTs out there that actually caused security problems?
yeah, so I long-lived identity is definitely causing a lot of issues. This is why the, I don't know, revocation list exists. And I don't know, I feel revocation list is it's a mechanism, but it's pretty easily defeated from a different like attack standpoint perspective. But in some environments, you need something like this. In some cases, you cannot avoid having long-lived credentials. That requires you to be creative. But standards like SPIFFE pushes you to really toward very short-lived identities, right? It's like hours or even minutes that solves the problem of revocation lists, right? Because identity will be expired. There are definitely use cases, specifically more on a human side, where it might be necessary, but we always advocating for using expiration on top of revocation list in the infrastructure level because of the complexity of implementation and easy defense strategies if you have something compromised.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not like X509 makes revocation easy either, um, but OAuth revocation, JWT revocation, I think is something that the industry needs a solution for.
Maybe, yeah, I'm not an expert in the human side of authentication and authorization, so I'm sure there are a bunch of use cases where this needed, but again, I would be advocating, knowing the history of Microsoft and a block list for that's built into the operation system with CAs, right? Like this just shows us that it's never been efficient for the machine level. But there's certainly use cases for human access and authorization where it needed. I'm just not an expert there.
Yeah. And it seems so easy because from a business level, you're like, oh, we've identified the hacker. Let's revoke all those tokens that we issued them.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're like, well, no, we can't actually do that. And even if we make a server-side standard for revocation, it wouldn't help because it's the clients that need to check for revocation. So we can release a new server-side feature at Glue for revocation and for status lists, but still, culturally, developers have to decide that they're going to do this in their applications, or the revocation itself is.
I think it's a very complex problem because they like what is a propagation time when you realize something is compromised and then you can put it on a list and it's get updated everywhere. Sometimes it's like from infrastructure perspective, like you need to build a lot of automation that needs to be efficient. And then you're trying to make things efficient, like, oh, there is a caching involved and all these things. And then you kind of need to consider like how do you actually push these updates? And in most of the cases for, I would say, machine to machine communication, these problems are easier solved with just shortening the TTL of identities.
Yeah. Make them expire more quickly instead of like figuring out how to revoke them.
Right, exactly. Because there are different patterns. They all have the pros and cons, and I feel it's like very complicated to implement, especially in distributed systems. And again, it's like very easily defeated if you have enough privileges or you compromise something. So you can always defeat against like a serial.
Yeah, the delivery of the revocation list itself is essential because if there's any compromise of that system, then your whole like security is like bets are off because
Right. Yeah.
it was revoked, but it never got there.
Mm-hmm.
Before the call, we were talking about how you felt that a lot of enterprises maybe overcomplicate their authorization policies on the infrastructure side. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on how enterprises should think about simplifying their infrastructure policies.
Yeah, I feel it's often kind of engineers love to solve everything in one shot. And that's often lead to coupling systems like an authentication and authorization, or coupling human authentication and authorization with an infrastructure level to make your, I would say, infrastructure layer to do authorization and being aware of your business logic. What I always trying to advocate for decoupling systems that makes things often way easier solvable, and there should be authorization, or I would say general purpose authorization system or backend for your business logic and for your developers writing applications, not make them thinking every time I have this feature, how do I implement, I don't know, airbag, hayback, or a proper authorization for this. Should be pretty easy for them. What I don't want to happen, they write in the microservice and then put in, I don't know, OPA agent next to this, and then thinking about a policy for this specific application or for this specific microservice, doing some business level logic authorization that's relying on some specific mechanism, like, I don't know, whether it's JWT or something else, right? And then thinking, oh, what other services can talk to this specific service, and then repurposing what they have, like an OPA agent, to do the infrastructure level authorization. So what SPIFFE does is pushes you toward decoupling this and basically having a really good identifiers for your infrastructure application layers that often follows pretty simple patterns, like your organization and your application patterns. Like, let's say here's a user service, and here's my, I don't know, PCI DSS environment where we're processing money transactions. That could be like completely different security boundaries, like completely different trust domains, and your infrastructure authorization in this case could be like very simple.
Okay, it's sort of abstract. So you're saying that it sounds like you don't like the idea of developers having to use externalized policies. You said OPA, but let's just say OPA generically is a way to externalize policies, and for the enterprise, and that enables the enterprise to review those policies without having to look, dive into the code of the application. Um,
All
do you
right,
think
coupling
that's
them.
overcomplicated and that we shouldn't try and externalize policies in the applications?
Oh, it's totally fine for the application, especially for business logic. I just think it is overkill to use this for your infrastructure level, where you're saying, oh, this service A can talk to B, but cannot talk to service C, right? This is a pretty simple policy. It does need to consider any attributes of the service itself, right?
Yeah.
Because like your service is not dynamic. It's not like, I don't know, moving between countries or like department. The boundary is usually pretty clear on that logic.
You know
Yeah.
what this reminds me of? You remember this probably, but at one point we could use TCP/IP wrappers on a server, or we could use a firewall.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point we would say, why do we need the darn firewall? Let's our TCP wrappers do that, right? Is there sort of an analogy here in what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of. It's kind of decoupling systems and do things. It's like you can implement some of this logic, right, in a firewall as well, right? But do you really need to? I think they usually manage by different teams, and like you don't want your infrastructure to be dependent on changes in the business logic of an application, because application nowadays is like pretty complex, consists of, I don't know, multiple services or sub applications managed by different teams, and this is typically what you see in enterprise companies. You don't want to be like your developers writing a code for a business logic and also need to know how infrastructure layer works, right? What is between, I don't know, the age and how the requests propagating through different layers of load balancers, right? Like otherwise all the developers needs to be an expert in everything. So the decoupling of the system helps.
I see. Well, we're sort of at the end. We leave this last time for you to have last thoughts, and you can talk about anything you want. You can tell everyone about Spiral or Spiral events, or you can give your last thoughts on token-based access control. But you get the floor. What are your last thoughts?
Yeah, I would probably wrap it up with all the technologies are good. We always need to think about where and how you use them. And at Spiral, I don't know, many people think about us as like workload identity company, but we hope we're not just focusing on a technology piece. We help enterprise companies to solve very serious problems, like whether it is an NHI or overprivileged accounts, or how do you solve a secret zero problem, or in many cases people do not realize that our secret manager is nice, but you need to authenticate to that somehow, and where your workload gets something to authenticate there, right? Solving these problems with different technologies is not always obvious, and we always in engineering need to get down to what are we actually trying to solve, the business problem or technology problem. So please don't over-rotate on technology problems.
Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming onto the live stream. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time because I'm really have been fascinated by the work that's going on in the SPIFFE community, and especially the innovation around workloads and machine identity or non-human identity or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, the different terms.
Coming on, Eli.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. That was fun. Happy to get there anytime soon.
So just a little bit of housekeeping. I want to remind everyone a good way to support the podcast or live stream, I should say, is by following it on LinkedIn. We're trying to increase our followers, so please follow on LinkedIn. The next episode is tomorrow, which is unusual, but it got rescheduled. So we have a token-based access control discussion with Jerry from Strata and Atul from Signal, and that should be
fantastic. Good friends.
Okay, thanks, Eli. Thanks, audience.
Thank you so much, everyone. Like, share.